What's up guys, welcome back to the channel, and today we are revisiting Deep Rock's resident daredevil and gravity denier, the Scout, to give you an idea on how to play him if you're just starting off. If you're confused, yes, I have done one of these videos a long time ago, but since it was one of the first videos I ever made, I feel like I could have done them a little bit better, plus the information has updated a little bit since then, so I am going to be going back through the Scout and essentially trying to just improve on what I did before. So today we are going to cover how the Scout plays, the weapons and gadgets he has access to, the mission types that he's best suited for, as well as some other useful things about him in a little bit greater detail. So if you guys are ready, let's learn about who is most likely the reason why Mission Control has absolutely no faith in us, the Scout. By the way, if you enjoy this kind of video, be sure to let me know by hitting that like button, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another upload. So what does it mean to play the Scout? What kinds of things does the Scout do for the team, and how is he meant to be played? Well, the whole motif for the Scout could be summed up in 3 different things. He is by far the best at mobility, by far the best at single target damage, and by far the best at falling to his death. In all seriousness though, the Scout is very focused and very dependent on mobility and information gathering. He is, as I've said several times before, the eyes and ears of the rest of the team. His specialties are getting information, allowing the team to know more about what's going on around them, as well as doing a good amount of crowd control, but also more specifically being good at taking off single problematic threats from a distance. As a Scout, you don't really want to be in one place for too long, and his kit basically focuses on you being very mobile, with everything from resource gathering to just scouting out the caves farther on down the line. The Scout is basically always going to be moving forward, which can play into his combat capabilities just as well. His utility tool, the flare gun, is very nice but also a bit basic. It doesn't really do anything too crazy. It lights up the cave much better than the normal flares that you're able to throw, and basically just gives the rest of the team information as to what's coming their way, and again leans into his information gathering capabilities. Now, his traversal tool is incredibly straightforward and probably the easiest to use. It's a simple grappling hook. You fire in the direction you want to go and it will pull you wherever you are aimed at. It's very straightforward. The physics of it are a little bit wonky. It can basically make it so that way you don't take any fall damage. It's great for saving yourself, as well as just getting to those incredibly hard to reach places without having to cut too much terrain or do anything like that. The only real issue with the grappling hook, and it's not even necessarily an issue, is it is the only traversal tool that all of the classes have that is relatively selfing. Nobody else can really utilize the grappling hook or benefit from it except for the Scout himself, which is the only real issue. But then again, I guess you could also make the case that the grappling hook allows him to get to resources that the entire team could use. So in a way, it's not entirely selfish. It's just mainly selfish in the sense that only the Scout is able to utilize it. Now, the Scout's weapons are by far some of the most versatile and easy to use options in the entire game, for the most part at least. He doesn't use very intricate fancy weapons like the driller or technological crazy things like the engineer. He instead just uses normal weapons, normal guns with a couple of modifications to them. And basically, if you've played any other form of standard first-person shooter, the Scout's weapons are very, very easy to use. It's just things like assault rifles, single-shot rifles, crossbows, and the occasional high-tech sci-fi weapon. And all of these factors basically lead to the Scout being a very fun and relatively easy class to pick up for the first time. While yes, the Scout does have a lot of responsibilities surrounding him, once you're at the lower levels, it's mainly more about just getting used to the way he plays. And if you are transitioning from other first-person shooters and coming over to Deep Rock, chances are the Scout is probably going to be the easiest one for you to pick up, again because of his self-sustainability as well as his weapon choices. So going a bit deeper into the Scout's actual gear and weaponry, in terms of combat capabilities, he has a very big focus on conventional weapons and really good single-target damage. The key thing with the Scout is being able to find the most problematic threat in the group and take it out relatively quickly. All of his weapons, for the most part, have relatively high accuracy and pinpoint damage, very good weak spot damage, a good amount of armor breaking, but very high accuracy above all else, again with a couple of exceptions. Now, I've already covered all of the Scout's weapons in greater detail in their own specific videos, so if you want to learn more about them, be sure to check them out. So I'm just going to do a brief overview of each piece in this particular section. For primary weapons, the first option we have is the Deep Core GK2 rifle. As the starting primary weapon for the Scout, you really can't get much simpler than this. This is the standard issue assault rifle that if you've played any other type of FPS, you are probably relatively familiar with it. It's the standard high rate of fire with a good emphasis on short to mid-range combat with a decent amount of long range if you're able to build it up a certain way. And thankfully, there really isn't anything super complex about the GK2. It's very reliable, very straightforward. You point in the direction, you empty the mag, you reload, rinse and repeat. It is a very versatile and easy to use weapon that really does help the Scout be a quick and easy class to pick up for your first time. And thanks to its mod choices, you have a ton of different variability in the ways that you can build it out. You can go for a very strong pinpoint build with things like hollow point bullets. and gyro stabilization for better spread and weak point damage, or you could go for a little bit more of a bullet hose style thing with supercharged feed mechanism and hardened rounds just to be able to cut through any sort of armor that stands in your way. And for overclocks, there are some really good ones which don't really change up the weapon to a good degree, and if anything, just make them a little bit easier to use, with things like compact ammo just giving you a little bit more ammo and recoil control, to things like bullets of mercy which give you a relatively good damage boost without really too much of a drawback. And even though it's a unstable overclock, so it might seem a little bit intimidating, the AI stability engine makes the weapon very easy to control and incredibly good for damage output. All in all, the GK2 is really good for just an all-purpose weapon for the Scout, and even once you have several hundreds of hours into the game with the Scout, you will still probably be using this weapon to extremely effective degrees. If you want something a little bit more specific and classy though, then we have the M1000 Classic, the single-shot semi-auto rifle that is themed off of the M1 Garand from World War II, and this is basically one of the more satisfying weapons to use in the Scout's arsenal, but is still incredibly effective. The weapon has basically two firing modes. It has the standard shot, where basically just tapping the trigger will fire a normal bullet, but if you hold down the weapon, it will enter what is known as focus mode, where in which it will zoom in slightly, get more accurate, and you will fire a round that does significantly more damage, but consume more ammo and will also slow you down in the process. This allows you to have a lot more control over the type of things that you want to shoot. If you are in a situation where you're fighting a lot of small enemies, you can just tap trigger, and then if those problematic threats show up that you want to take out a little bit faster, you can focus down and have those high-powered shots capable for those bigger enemies. And there's a lot of ways that you can improve or make the focus shots function a little bit differently, from mods to overclocks, so you kind of have to just experiment with it a little bit. And overall, the M1000 does have some really good mod choices like super blow-through rounds just to give you a ton of penetration, or killing machine, which can make it so that you reload insanely fast, which depending on the overclock you pick can be very useful for the M1000. And speaking of overclocks, the M1000 has a lot of very interesting ones with some very simple options like minimal clips, giving you more ammo and reload, to more funky options like hover clock, which lets you hover in the air when you're focus shotting, which is very interesting, to one of my personal favorites, hipster, which just make the gun function very effectively when you're not using focus shots. So if you want to use it just in a more traditional sense, this is a very good one, to even things like the brand new Marked for Death, which is a very good overclock for a team situation as it debuffs any enemy that is hit by a focus shot. So as you can see, the M1000 has a lot of different ways that you could build it, from just a standard weapon powerhouse to a more supportive debuffing tool that can help the whole team. And again, I cannot understate how satisfying it is to use this weapon, especially when you hear that lovely reload ping. And for those of you who are fans of a more sci-fi oriented weaponry, we have the Drak 25 Plasma Carbine. While definitely a little bit more flashy and extravagant than some of the Scout weapons, it still functions relatively similarly to the rest of his kit. It basically is just an energy version of the GK2 at its core. It's a fast-firing plasma auto rifle. And the interesting thing about this particular weapon is it functions similar to the Gunner's Minigun and the Driller's EPC, where instead of having a traditional ammo system, it fires from a single massive battery and has a heat system where if you continuously fire the weapon, it will generate heat, and if it maxes out, it will overheat and not be able to be fired for a short time. Now, this can be either a good thing or a bad thing depending on the way that you have the weapon built, and I'll go into that in a moment. But basically, the Plasma Carbine is on par with the GK2 Assault Rifle and has that same sort of feel to it, but it has access to some more interesting capabilities as it is a energy weapon. It has a lot of very versatile different mods, from having things like Destructive Resonance Amp to give you better armor breaking, to things like Plasma Splash, which just make the projectiles have a little bit of a bigger splash radius, to even things like Overcharged PCF, which allows each projectile to have a chance to electrocute the target, which can be pretty useful depending on the rest of your kit. For overclocks, there are some really interesting ones like Aggressive Venting, which makes it so that way you actually want to overheat the weapon as much as you can because it gives you a damaging AoE around you, to things like the new Conductive Thermals, which is a very fun and support style overclock that makes it so that way elemental effects are even stronger, not even just for you, but for the rest of your team. And even things like Rewiring Mod for if you essentially want a infinite battery, or at the very least one that seems like it's never ending, as this will refund ammo for you whenever you are overheating. So while the Drak is very similar to the GK2, but just with a little bit more spice and flavor added to it, it is different enough to where it feels like it fills a role on its own that make it capable of handling many different things from small to big in its own unique way. Now, for secondary weapons, the Scout has some pretty traditional options, so it's a little bit more standard from this point forward, with a couple of exceptions. First, we have the jury-rigged boomstick, the sawed-off double barrel from hell. This thing is insanely fun and very effective to use. If you played any other type of game that has a sawed-off double-barrel shotgun or just a double-barrel shotgun to begin with, you probably know how this thing functions. Fire twice or once, depending on the overclock you have, and reload and do it again. Basically, only shoot this at enemies that are right in front of your face, and it will do wonders for both damage and crowd control. Now, the weapon does actually have an extra bit of damage on top of its normal bullet damage with a front AoE shockwave. Basically, there is a small area in front of the barrel that will do a set amount of explosive damage, which is a little bit interesting, that is separate from the actual bullet damage. So if you get right up in front of the enemy and then fire, they will take a lot of extra damage, and there are ways to make it a little bit better as well. Simply put, it is a close quarters powerhouse and has some incredibly fun options for build crafting. For mod choices, you have a lot of different ways that you can build this thing out, from super blow-through rounds again, which is really good on the shotgun because it allows you to hit multiple enemies, to things like the improved blast wave, which allows the blast wave that I just mentioned to be even stronger, to even things like white phosphorus shells, which allow you to convert a portion of the damage to heat damage, which is actually quite strong for spreading elemental effects, which the Scout really likes to do. In terms of overclocks, you have some pretty standard options like compact shells, which just give you a little bit more ammo, and jumbo shells, which give you a crap ton more damage at the cost of ammo, and probably the most fun one that the boomstick has access to is special powder. This doesn't change anything involving the weapon's damage or ammo, and it just gives you the ability to shotgun jump. Basically, you point this at the ground, jump in the air, and then fire, and it will fling you in whatever direction you are pointed at. It's a little bit fun, but just be careful with this one, as you can actually hurt yourself with it if you are not careful. And if you're trying to use the shotgun as a normal weapon, whatever you do not jump when firing, because you will fling yourself back, which I have done many times before in the past. Simply put, the boomstick is an incredibly effective weapon that can also be very fun given the right setup, and is one of my personal favorite weapons to use in the game, and has a ton of satisfaction when you do get to use it. And if you're looking for something a little bit more eccentric, then you have the Zhukov NUK-17 dual machine pistols. These are a very unique weapon that personally I do not use a whole lot with the Scout, not necessarily because they're bad, but just because I like his other options a little bit better. But the Zhukovs are still phenomenal to use if you want to use them and fulfill a good role in the rest of the Scout's kit. Basically, they are a pair of dual-wielded rapid-fire machine pistols that shoot through ammo in an incredibly fast way. Basically, the way the ammo consumption works on this particular weapon is that although they have their own separate ammo counters, they are basically considered one weapon and the ammo will be consumed a lot faster. It's a little bit hard to explain, but basically just know that you are going to be burning through ammo very fast. That being said, this is a phenomenal weapon for just flinging a bunch of bullets into enemy swarms and taking out massive groups of smaller threats, or just being able to do a ton of damage to singular threats if you're able to fling enough bullets into it. With things like hollow point bullets or increased caliber rounds, you can do a crap ton of damage to single targets if you're able to hit their weak spots. And with things like better weight balance and quick fire ejector, you can keep the bullets flinging out as fast as you possibly can and have much better accuracy, which in my opinion, the accuracy is probably the one thing that this weapon definitely needs help with the most. For overclocks, there are some very simple options. It only has one clean overclock with minimal magazines, but it is still really good as it just gives you a faster rate of fire and a shorter reload time. So you will be burning through ammo a little bit quicker, but it will increase the overall effectiveness of it. And probably the best one I would say for starting off with this weapon, if you have it, is the custom casings. This gives you more ammo to work with and actually lowers the rate of fire, which sounds like a detriment, but if you're just starting off with using the weapon, a slower rate of fire means you will burn through the ammo slower, which will give you more time to be able to get used to the way the weapon does fire. And then another great option is gas recycling, as this just makes the weapon hit like a truck. Although you are losing out on weak point damage and making the spread worse, the fact that this thing is going to hit significantly harder makes the Zhukovs function much more effectively. All in all, while a little bit more awkward to use, the Zhukovs are definitely a very fun weapon and make you feel like a dwarf version of John Wick. So if you want a pair of bullet hoses, then these things are definitely the ones for you. And then the last secondary option for the Scout is the Nishanka Bolt Shark crossbow. So to no one's surprise, of course, this weapon is a crossbow, which means that the ammo and magazine system works basically the same as any other crossbow in any other game. Fire off one shot and you have to reload, and for the most part, it is capable of very high single target damage. Bolt Shark has a lot of versatility and has the potential to do some incredibly high amounts of damage if built that way, as well as also being not a bad crowd control tool if you have the right setup for it. One of the unique features of the Bolt Shark crossbow is it has access to several different special ammo types that you can use. Basically, if you press the reload button while you already have a bolt loaded, you will instead swap to a special type of bolt that will do a secondary effect. Now, the bolt shark has 3 different types of bolts that you can specialize in, and they can be described as such. Pheromone bolts will make it so that way enemies will attack each other, which can be very good for breaking up groups of enemies. Chemical explosion bolts make it so that way the enemies will explode when they are defeated, and the explosion will do a good amount of damage to anything nearby. And taser bolts make it so that way any enemy affected is electrified, and if you fire 2 taser bolts within a certain radius of each other, they will form an electric fence that will shock enemies if they pass through. Now, these can be very effective in many different ways, and you can make it so that way the bolt shark has more or less special bolts, or that the effectiveness of their special bolts are better, with things like expanded special quiver to give you more special ammo, as well as increase the effectiveness of those particular special bolts, and potent special bolts to do a similar thing. Or you could lean into the more traditional style of the crossbow with things like Battle Frenzy to give you a much faster movement speed, or broadhead bolts just to give the normal bolts more damage. An interesting thing that I didn't mention about the crossbow is that if you do happen to miss with one of the bolts, you can actually retrieve it. You can actually go up to it, pick it up, and retrieve the bolt if it did not hit a target. And there's also a mod in Tier 4 called the Radio Transmitter module, which makes it so that way if you're aiming at a bolt that missed and is into a wall, you can actually magnetically pull it back to you. I don't necessarily know how it works, but it does work. For overclocks, there are a ton of different options for the bolt shark, which give it a lot of versatility. You have things like the Specialist, which again just make your special bolts even better. And then you have things like fire and cryo bolts to allow the normal bolts to have certain elemental effects, to even things like bodkin points, which allow the bolts to ricochet to multiple different enemies, which can again make the weapon a good crowd control tool, as I said before. Ultimately, I feel like the crossbow is probably the most versatile of the Scout's secondary weapons, and is also one of the more fun ones to use, as you have a lot of different ways that you can build it. Now, as is the case for all the other classes, the Scout also has an array of grenades that he can use, and the Scout actually has some of the more useful and effective grenades out of all the other classes. His starter choice is the Inhibitor Field Generator, which is a very unique grenade. Basically, when you throw it and it impacts the surface or an enemy, it will emit this static field around it that will slow down any enemy that is inside of the field, and the slowdown is pretty significant. This field also makes any enemies that are affected by the field to take additional damage, meaning that it is a great tool for softening up big threats for the rest of your team to take out. And another interesting point is that enemies that are affected by the IFGs are considered electrocuted, even though they are not technically electrocuted. Now, this sounds a little bit awkward, but there are certain mod choices like the magnetic shafts that the crossbow has that we just talked about, in which it will affect and interact with electrified enemies. So having something that can apply the electrocuted effect without necessarily actually applying it is quite useful. The second option is the cryo grenades, and these are pretty straightforward. When these explode, they make a large icy explosion, and they can freeze basically anything that you hit with it in one throw, with the exception of bigger things like dreadnoughts and just other really heavy targets. I said before that cryo damage is one of the most useful and powerful effects in the entire game, because any enemy that is frozen solid takes triple damage from all sources, which is incredibly powerful. This makes it so that way you can take out very big problematic threats incredibly quickly. And also, again, if you freeze anything that is flying, they will fall to the ground and shatter. Then we have the pheromone canisters, which function very uniquely, but in a very good way. Pheromone canisters basically release pheromones that will make the bugs start fighting each other. It makes them go crazy, and it makes them start fighting whatever they come across, including each other, which can be very, very good for clearing up big problematic groups and essentially making them take each other out. While obviously this doesn't do any direct damage, it does do a good job at taking pressure off of you, and there are a lot of ways that you can use the pheromones to your advantage. Then last up, we have the voltaic stun sweepers, which are the electric boomerangs, which are incredibly fun to use. Basically, you throw these things out and it will home in onto the closest enemy, and it will bounce up to 9 times to different enemies or even the same enemy before either expiring, or if you do not actually hit a target entirely and you completely miss, it will actually come back to you and you won't have wasted it, which is incredibly useful. Now, when it hits the enemy, it will do damage and also apply the electrocution effect, making them take damage over time and again slowing them down. So this is also really, really good for taking out and slowing down big groups of enemies, and it can make big groups of very small enemies, such as swarmers and shockers, very, very trivial. And even if you have a couple of Praetorians walking around, you can bounce this between them and slow them down and make them easier targets for your allies. So simply put, all of the Scout's grenades are really good at debilitating and debuffing the enemies to some degree. And instead of doing straight up normal damage like some of the other grenades in the game, the Scout is all about elemental effects when it comes to his grenades. So next, talking about his support tool, he has his flare gun. Flare gun is relatively basic. There's not really a whole lot to talk about with it. It fires these flare spikes into the wall, which illuminate and brighten up the area around it, and these flares are significantly better than the standard ones that all the dwarves have. It's really good for getting information and letting the rest of the team know exactly what is in the cave room that you're in, and can really be good on holdout missions when you're in one specific spot for a certain amount of time. It's really good just to be able to see everything and know where every enemy is coming from, so there's not really a whole lot to talk about with the flare gun. It's just really, really good for information and light. And the last tool for the Scout in his equipment arsenal is his traversal tool, which is the grappling hook. As I said in the beginning, the grappling hook is probably one of the most straightforward and easiest tools to use, as all you have to do is point it at the direction you want to go to, and provided you're within the right range, it will pull you directly to the piece of terrain that you're at. Again, it's the only real selfish traversal tool in the entire game because only the Scout can utilize it, but he is able to use it in a way that the rest of the team can benefit from, like hitting those hard-to-reach mineral spots. The grappling hook can basically help you get out of dodge in any situation. You can use it offensively, defensively. There's just so many different ways that you can use the grappling hook. You can even fire it directly down to the ground if you're falling, and you somehow will not take any fall damage. I'm still not exactly sure how that works, but that's how it works. And again, there really isn't much to talk about with the grappling hook. It's very straightforward, very easy, just point, zip, and you are where you want to be. So now talking about the different mission types that the Scout specializes in. Since the Scout is all about mobility and high single target damage, he actually has a good place in pretty much any mission type you could think of, but there are a couple that he excels in. First, egg hunt missions are made very easy with the Scout as he's able to gather the eggs very quickly, and since they can sometimes spawn in problematic areas, he can make it very easy to get to, whereas the other classes might struggle a little bit. Now, with that same thought in mind, coin extractions are also a good pick for the Scout as it follows the same sort of ruling. You can find the acquired gems that are stuck in really difficult or hard to reach places or that are just directly in the ceilings, and he can collect them relatively quickly while the rest of the classes do everything else that they need to do. Since he is very good at single target damage and also just debilitating and debuffing enemies, eliminations are also a very good choice for him, since not only is he just capable of doing heavy amounts of damage to the dreadnoughts themselves, but with things like the new Mark for Death or the conductive thermals, or basically all of his elemental debuffs, he can make just keeping them in line significantly easier. Finally, Deep Scan is another good place for the Scouts since those caves are all interconnected without any dirt walls between them, and they can be sometimes a little bit labyrinthian. The Scout can do very good work at finding the resonance crystal quickly, since he is able to cover ground throughout the caves in a short amount of time better than most of the other classes. So in summary, the Scout, as I said before, is a very fun and fast-paced class that is really good for people who like to be constantly moving or just like very high-octane gameplay. He has a very pivotal role in both the information gathering and single target takedowns, and again, his gear is really easy to pick up and he has a very flexible kit that is capable of doing a lot of different things to a good degree. While I would still say yes, he definitely does have a lot better single target capabilities, he can still be built out for strong crowd control like the rest of the classes, but in essence, he is a combination of the eyes in the sky and the big game hunter, letting you know what enemies are coming from where and taking out the biggest, most problematic threats before they can get close to you. Pair that with his insane ability to gather minerals incredibly quickly and do clutch revives whenever he can, as he is very fast. If you like moving quick and shooting fast, then the Scout is probably the class that you want to play. Well, there you have a basic guide to learning on how to be a Scout in Deep Rock Galactic, and hopefully you learned a few things, and hopefully I did a better job than I did before. If you did learn a couple more things, or just maybe learned a little bit better on how to be a Scout, let me know down in the comments. Anyway, hope you guys found this video helpful and informative. If you did, please be sure to give it a like because it tells me what types of videos you guys want to see. And consider becoming a member and subscribing today as it really helps out the channel a lot. Rocket Stone Miners, I'll see you in the next video.